The Middle East has never been a picture of stability, but the events of 2024 so far are reaching a whole new level of mayhem. An ongoing war in the Palestinian enclave of Gaza is growing darker and darker as the entire world is forced to reckon with both the actions of Hamas and the actions of Israel. The Houthi rebels of Yemen have evoked a massive response from the powers of the global West after enacting an ad hoc blockade across one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. Iranian missiles have fallen in Pakistan and Kurdish Iraq. Pakistani missiles have fallen inside of Iran. Lebanon's Hezbollah organization is acting as an increasingly obvious puppeteer in control of the failed Lebanese state. Americans are under attack in Iraq. The Islamic State has made a major return, and Iran might be mere inches from getting its hands on the bomb. So in today's special episode of Warographics, we're going to examine the rapidly devolving Mideast crisis on multiple levels. We'll travel to hotspots on the ground from Yemen to Gaza to Iraq, and we'll examine the shadowy networks, the spiderweb of allegiance, and the hidden hands at work behind the scenes, all pushing and pulling this crisis toward any of 1,000 competing endgames. At stake is nothing less than the future of the entire region in what may rapidly spiral into the defining conflict of this year, and possibly even this decade. Set up and the starting gun. Trying to establish a single starting point for the conflict in the Middle East is like trying to identify the single point of disagreement that started World War I. Much like the conflict that kicked off the modern age of warfare, the Mideast crisis is a multi-headed hydra, a series of spiraling catastrophes that all intersect with each other and all boil over at once. But much like World War I, it's far easier to point to the one single act that prompted the much, much larger explosion that came afterward. In this case, there was no Gavrilo Princip to assassinate the Middle East's proverbial Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Instead, the act that toppled the region's fragile balance was a much larger attack, one that went down on October the 7th, 2023. Now, we'll return to that date in just a moment, but in this particular case, we've got to understand how all the dominoes were arranged prior if we're going to understand what happened when those same dominoes began to fall. Now, previously on Warographics and on our sister channel, Into the Shadows, we've discussed at length the idea that the Middle East has spent decades inside a long, cold war. That Cold War has been contested between a whole range of Middle Eastern and global nations, but primarily it's been shared between three. Iran, broadly representing the interests of Shia Islam, Russia, China, and many of the world's small anti-Western nations. Saudi Arabia, broadly representing the interests of Sunni Islam and a majority of Middle Eastern nations, while straddling loyalties between the major world powers, and Israel, broadly representing the interests of the Middle East's Jewish population, the United States, and the European Union. Now, we got to be very clear here that this explanation leaves a lot of nuance by the wayside, but in the interest of keeping this video to a somewhat reasonable length, we'll just have to accept this basic view for now. This three-sided conflict has been ongoing for decades, and like any other Cold War, it hasn't led to an outbreak of a major traditional war, that is, a hot war, between any of its major players. Instead, it's been fought quietly, behind the scenes, and by leaning on a wide range of regional neighbors, non-state actors, and international powers. Iran has cultivated a wide range of proxy forces that we'll be talking about throughout this video, from the Hamas organization in Gaza to Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen to a network of militias in Iraq, all of which receive guidance and material support from Iran to effect change in their own countries. Saudi Arabia leverages tremendous amounts of oil money, strong ties with the international community, and the support of a majority of Middle Eastern established governments. It also has its own network of proxies that it supports financially as well. Israel leverages a highly active intelligence and sabotage apparatus across the Middle East, supports other Third Allegiance groups in the Middle East like the Kurdish diaspora, and is a highly westernized nation whose close ties to America and Europe make it economically and geopolitically competitive with the Middle East's other two centers of influence. But this balance began shifting over the last several years as a US brokered effort saw Israel slowly but surely start to regain trade and diplomatic relations with smaller countries throughout the Arab world. In 2020, Israel signed deals with Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and the United Arab Emirates to normalize relations, and a trade deal with the UAE wasn't long following. Normalization efforts continued with more and more nations until, in 2023, it appeared that Israel was on the verge of landing the big one, a potential deal with Saudi Arabia, which would have dramatically reduced tensions between two of the Middle East's three most pivotal actors. Also in 2023, a series of talks brokered by China saw Iran and Saudi Arabia restore their diplomatic relations in what came as a major surprise to Western onlookers, but a much-needed sign of hope that perhaps those nations too could eventually figure out a path past their decades of conflict. And with real promise of a diplomatic through line from Israel to Saudi Arabia all the way to Iran came the potential for a third and final reconciliation in which Israel and Iran, unlikely as it may seem, would eventually figure out a way to live with each other. But the international air of optimism around normalization, well, that wasn't going to survive for very long. In the months leading up to the current crisis, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and all the other established powers inside this dynamic have been forced to learn a very valuable lesson. The proxy forces, no matter how dependent they are on their backers, are still ultimately out for themselves. With normalization well underway between the Israelis and the Saudis, and between the Saudis and the Iranians, groups like Hamas, the Houthi rebels, and various groups of Kurdistan, the Palestinian Authority, and many others have been forced to recognize that their primary backers may no longer be interested in supporting their independence movements and rebellions. Normalization is a stabilizing force for the Middle East and for the world, but from the perspective of these smaller groups, it's a major setback. In a best-case scenario, their flows of money, weapons, and geopolitical influence may dry up and force them to go it alone. Or in a worst-case scenario, their organizations may be unable to survive on their own or might even be dismantled outright as part of a reconciliation process taken apart by the same nation that once built them up. With stakes like that, and as contrary to the common good as it may seem, groups like these are strongly incentivized to ensure that animosity between the Middle East's major powers will continue by any means necessary. And it's here that we can finally talk about the precipitating incident that kicked off this whole round of hostilities, the massive October the 7th terror attack that Hamas launched into Israel in 2023. This attack was devastating to the nation of Israel, with nearly 700 Israeli civilians, 373 members of the Israeli Defense Force and other security forces, and dozens of foreign nationals killed and hundreds more taken hostage. Launched by surprise from the encircled Palestinian enclave of Gaza, the terror attack represented a profound intelligence failure by Israel and a horrific expression of the Hamas organization's will to perpetrate stunning violence on ordinary Israelis. It also demanded a response, and one that Israel has provided in force.
Seeing the most intense fighting in weeks.
The resulting Israel-Hamas war is widely understood to have resulted in tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians and Hamas militants being killed, hundreds, including upward of 10,000 children. Nearly the entirety of Gaza's population and 500,000 Israelis have been displaced, and the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, has perpetrated apocalyptic levels of violence that have led much of the world, initially understanding of Israel's desire for retribution against Hamas, to turn away from what the International Court of Justice is now being asked to evaluate as a possible act of genocide. Normalization has been but one of the Israel-Hamas war's casualties, but it's been a massively significant one nonetheless. Saudi Arabia has now suspended its efforts to normalize relations with Israel, and perhaps more importantly, much of the Middle Eastern public has begun to exert tremendous pressure against normalization, even in countries where those deals have already been signed. The war has prompted a range of reactions, both positive and negative, toward the Hamas organization, but more broadly, it's led to a groundswell of support for the people of Palestine in what much of the Middle Eastern public sees as an ongoing example of repression and outright destruction of an Arab population. But the Israel-Hamas war hasn't led to a reorganization of the Middle East in opposition to Israel. It's just not that simple. Instead, the Israel-Hamas war has been a starting gun, a massive injection of hostility, rage, and direct action that in retrospect appears to have sent a signal across the entire region that the time for major hostilities has arrived and that there's going to be no looking back. Axis of resistance. From the origins of the current crisis, we come to the moment that we're in now, a situation so multifaceted that we could go on for hours without capturing every single solitary flashpoint. But across all the major ones, and many of the minor ones, there's one common thread where we've simply got to start, and that thread, of course, is Iran. It's no coincidence that in just about every one of the Middle East's current hotspots, one of three things is true. Option A, Iran has been attacked. Option B, Iran is attacking somebody else. Option C, one of the major factions in whatever individual conflict we're talking about has secured Iran's tangible support. That's because Iran sits at the center of what's known as the Axis of Resistance, an informal coalition of nations and non-state actors that, generally speaking, oppose Israel, the West, the Arab Gulf states of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and a few others, and Sunni Islamist jihadists. Despite the term Axis generally being one that the West assigns to groups it considers the bad guy, from World War II's Axis powers to the Axis of evil in the post-9/11 years, this is actually a label that these groups, including Iran, have circulated amongst themselves, and that is no accident. From their own perspectives, this informal network gives Iran and their many proxies a mechanism to lean on each other and resist more powerful actors relying not just on the weapons and the cash, but the expertise, the special forces support, and the strategic guidance of the Iranian government. To do this, Iran relies on a wide range of intermediaries, traveling envoys, smuggling networks, and financial systems, but perhaps most notable among them are the Quds Force. Now, we've actually done a whole separate video on the Quds Force, so check that out if you'd like to learn more. But basically, the Quds Force are Iran's version of the American Special Forces or the Russian Spetsnaz. It's their job to operate far afield from Iran, doing their work in secret with the hopes of organizing and at times leading organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. Once those groups are established, it's the Quds Force that serves as their primary intermediaries, their strategic advisors and more. In Iran, they're considered to be a part of the so-called forward defense strategy, where the thinking goes that it's on the Quds Force to make sure that Iran's battles against Israel or America don't take place on Iranian soil. So, where do those battles take place instead? Well, the first and most obvious answer, right in the moment, would be the Gaza Strip. Since the October 7th attack, Israel's counteroffensive has stormed through Gaza with astonishing intensity. Israel's stated goals include eliminating the Hamas organization, returning all hostages in Hamas captivity to Israel, and establishing a status quo that would prevent Gaza from threatening Israel in the future. However, the offensive has, thus far, seen the deaths of upwards of 25,000 Gazans, including over 10,000 children and thousands of elderly and other non-combatants. While those estimates do come from the Gaza Health Ministry, a Hamas affiliate, they're largely supported by international estimates and aid organizations on the ground, in keeping with the Gaza Health Ministry's prior tendency to give accurate death toll estimates rather than inflating them. Critical shipments of fuel, food, and water have been blockaded. Most of Gaza's hospitals are no longer functioning. Disease is spreading rapidly. Civil infrastructure basically no longer exists, and upwards of 85% of the population has been displaced. With Gaza's border with Egypt almost entirely closed and the rest of Gaza under siege from surrounding Israel, there is nowhere for the people of Gaza to go. Hamas continues to fight against Israel within the chaos, fiercely opposing Israel's attempts to fully dismantle the terror organization. While Hamas is powerless to oppose Israel's air campaign, they've nonetheless continued resistance that is all but guaranteed to bring the IDF further and further into southern Gaza, after the north, according to the IDF, has been largely rid of Hamas infrastructure. Although Hamas's grand motives are not entirely clear, it seems more and more likely that Hamas continues its resistance largely in order to receive support across the Arab world for a free Palestine and remind the Arab world of why it has considered Israel an enemy for generations. At the expense of the lives of tens of thousands of Gazans who Hamas neither claimed nor attempted to protect, Hamas has created a situation in which the Arab world is forced to either condemn and even oppose Israel, or otherwise be condemned themselves as supporters of a massive act of violence against an Arab population. Iran has publicly denied being aware of the Hamas attacks on October the 7th before they happened, and certainly some indications would suggest that those attacks were pretty much Hamas's idea. But nonetheless, Iran's other proxy forces have stepped up their own attacks, seizing on the destabilization that Hamas created in order to move the entire Middle East in the axis of resistance's favor. Among Iran's other proxies, perhaps none are so sophisticated or so independently powerful as the Hezbollah organization, which was created partially by Iran all the way back in the 1980s in order to resist an Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon. Since then, they've become a dominant political party inside Lebanon while still retaining a strong independent militia inside the country. And since the attacks of October 7th, Hezbollah's elite militant units have been engaged in nearly daily skirmishes in and around northern Israel. Those skirmishes have involved everything from rocket attacks to gun battles to assaults on outposts and military targets on Israeli territory. In the weeks before this episode was written, Israel has launched increasingly targeted attacks against Hezbollah commanders, while Hezbollah has retaliated more and more forcefully in return. Although both sides maintain publicly that they don't want a war, Israel's demands of Hezbollah and Hezbollah's demands of Israel are unlikely to be met. Until that changes, Israel and Hezbollah remain on a knife edge. And if you've paid even cursory attention to global news in the last several months, then you're no doubt aware of the Houthi rebel organization, a resistance movement in the nation of Yemen that spent years as the Iran-backed faction in a brutal civil war where Saudi Arabia and the UAE funneled money, guidance, and soldiers into the Yemeni government that the Houthis were fighting. At present, the Houthis control Yemen's most populous areas, and although the nation is keeping a fragile ceasefire for now, the Houthis have chosen to remain active rather than resting on their laurels. Now, though, they've turned their attention to the Red Sea, an incredibly busy global shipping lane where Houthi boats can exert power, but where Houthi missiles and drones absolutely can. Over the course of the last couple of months, the Houthis have launched dozens of drone and missile attacks against commercial vessels, with the stated goal of helping Hamas and the people of Gaza by trying to prevent Israeli ships and maritime industry from coming to its shores. In broadening the scope of the Mideast crisis to global shipping, the Houthis have brought upon themselves direct intervention from Britain, the US, and a handful of other nations, and they've been successful in forcing major companies to divert their traffic around the Red Sea, significantly compromising their interests and threatening worldwide commerce. The Houthis have successfully become the first non-state actor in history to impose a naval blockade, however brief, without taking to the seas themselves. And even while they're suffering withering retribution by way of a US-led campaign, they've continued to launch their attacks. Iranian weapons, including components for Iranian-made ballistic and cruise missiles, have been intercepted en route to the Houthis, and Iran has been accused of being very directly involved in the Houthis' campaign of maritime terror attacks. Although the US and the rest of the international coalition in the Red Sea appear to be trying very hard not to become any more militarily involved than they've got to be, that seems to be a losing effort so long as the Houthis refuse to back down under the coalition's pressure. And then there are the axis of resistance members that get talked about far less. Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, and perhaps Iran's most powerful client of all, the Syrian ruling regime of Bashar al-Assad. We'll start with the militias first, a series of well-armed, very well-connected organizations that straddle the line between resistance and terrorism. Many of them control pockets of Iraq, where not even the Iraqi military will travel without permission. In Iraq in particular, these militias use their relative peace and their lack of fear of Iraq's weak government in order to spend their time producing drones, rockets, and other complex weapons that are then shuttled around the rest of the axis of resistance. These militias have been targeted by the US via airstrikes, and they've hit right back, launching attacks on America's roughly 2,500 troops still stationed there. These militias have access to a 1,000-mile-long border with Iran, and from Iraq, they can travel into 5 neighboring nations. In Syria, it's much of the same, with Shiite militias trading fire with 900-ish Americans there. In Iraq, these militias are getting more and more a stake in the government, and in 2021, they were able to send enough candidates to parliament via their own Hezbollah-like political parties that they were able to become part of the governing coalition and select a prime minister who's loyal to their cause. In return, the militias now receive direct funding via the Iraqi treasury. And the nation of Syria has long been called Iraq's closest ally in the Middle East, with the ruling regime of Bashar al-Assad largely owing its survival to Iran after a decade of incredibly ruinous civil war. Syria is widely understood to be complicit in helping to ferry Iranian weapons and funding westward to Hamas and Hezbollah, and they're believed to host secret research stations for Iran to develop missile technology and other advanced weaponry. Iran is able to launch strikes on Syrian territory in Syria's own interest in combat against the Islamic State, anti-regime rebel groups, and others, and Iran is a long-standing facilitator for Syria to conduct modern-day relations with major world powers across the world who might otherwise be reticent to engage them. Crises coming together. Alright, so that's the axis of resistance, a long-standing informal network that's gotten quite a bit more unified since the Israel-Hamas war kicked off. Now more than ever, these groups appear to be operating in a coordinated manner, forming a united front in stark opposition to Israel, the United States, and anybody else who would ally themselves with either rival power. Cross-border collaboration is far more common now than it was a few years ago, and even the more independent or self-sufficient proxies like Hamas or Hezbollah have been more than willing to work within the limits of Iran's strategic vision if it means an increased inter-reliance on each other. But the axis of resistance isn't the only source of tensions in the Middle East right now, far from it. Perhaps the most unexpected Middle East headline of 2024 thus far was the one that came on January the 16th, announcing that Iran had launched missiles at a foreign target directly, and not against Israel, but against Pakistan. When it happened, the strike went down in the Balakh region, which straddles the 560-mile border between both nations. The strikes were targeted against the militant group Jaish al-Adl, who launched an attack last December that led to the deaths of 2 Iranian troops. 2 days later, Pakistan retaliated, striking separatist groups based in Iran's half of the Baloch region in a missile attack that killed at least 9 people, including 4 children. The tit-for-tat exchange was a dramatic escalation of tensions significantly eastward of where the Middle East's violence had previously been contained, and both Pakistan and Iran have accused each other of harboring terrorist groups, that is to say, anti-Pakistan groups harbored by Iran and anti-Iran groups harbored by Pakistan. Significantly, these strikes seem to have very little to do with what's been happening in Gaza, and perhaps even more importantly, they involved a direct military action by Iran with zero involvement from proxy forces. And it wasn't the only one either. The night before the Pakistan attack on January the 15th, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps launched an attack on what they claimed was a secret spy headquarters for Israel's Mossad agency located in the northern Iraqi city of Erbil. The attack came by way of missile strike, and while it's unknown whether any Israeli nationals, let alone any Mossad operatives, were indeed killed, the strike is believed to have killed 4 civilians and injured 6 others. Among their number was the multi-millionaire businessman Peshrar Dizii and several members of his family who were killed in their home when it was impacted by a missile. It's important to note that Erbil is not a place that's run under Iraqi jurisdiction. Instead, it's the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, controlled by the local ethnic Kurdish population who've their own international ties and diplomatic relationships. These relationships, by the way, bring them generally into alignment with the interests of Israel and the United States. But while Iraqi Kurdistan's semi-autonomous status means that Iraq is not entirely responsible for the existence of an alleged Mossad outfit, it's still a major black eye for Iraq in the eyes of Iran, who've exhausted significant resources, giving Iran-friendly politicians control of the country. And then there's Israel's offensive actions, which have gone far beyond the Gaza Strip in recent weeks. Israel has quickly intensified its policy of targeted assassinations in Lebanon, not just in Hezbollah-held southern areas close to Israel's own border, but deep into Lebanese territory, where rather important notions of geopolitics, like, say, respect for a neighbor nation's sovereignty, appear to have gone out of the window. Israel has launched strikes into the suburbs of the Lebanese capital of Beirut to kill high-ranking Hamas representatives. They've carried out a strike against a senior member of Hezbollah's own elite Radwan unit, and they've conducted a similar attack in the Lebanese port city of Tyre, killing a Hezbollah commander and a tech entrepreneur in the process. These have drawn retaliation from Hezbollah units against both military targets and civilian towns, with varying levels of damage inflicted. But far more pivotal than Israel's strikes into Lebanon was the one that came on Saturday, January 20th, when an Israeli airstrike hit a command post in Syria's capital city of Damascus. That command post, though, wasn't in use to serve the Syrian regime. Instead, it was occupied by elite commanders of the Iranian Quds Force, the same organization that props up Iranian proxies around the world. 10 people were killed, including General Sadegh Omirzadeh, the Quds Force's intelligence chief in Syria, as well as his deputy. A total of 3 Iranians at the command post were said to be commanders, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, and they were holding a meeting at the time with representatives of other groups supported by Iran. This wasn't the first Israeli airstrike to kill Iranian elite military leaders in recent months, but by far, it is the most significant. The strikes were forcefully condemned by the Iranian government, who vowed revenge and worked to publicly draw connections between Israel and the Islamic State terror organization. And that comparison to the Islamic State doesn't come without reason for Iran. Even beyond Israel, the belligerent group that's done the most damage to Iran recently was the Islamic State. The group took credit this month for a January 4th attack in Iran, which US and other Western intelligence services have confirmed was most likely perpetrated by Islamic State. In that attack, 2 Islamic State suicide bombers detonated their explosive belts at a memorial ceremony in honor of the Quds Force's most famous member ever, their former commander, Qassam Soleimani. The memorial, marking the 4th anniversary of his assassination by a US drone strike in 2020, was interrupted by a massive bomb blast and then a second blast targeting emergency responders. Nearly 100 people were killed. They were the deadliest terror attacks in Iran since the Islamic Revolution installed the current regime to power all the way back in 1979. Iran has since retaliated with missile strikes against Islamic State bases in Syria, an act that might have come as a surprise to international observers before these last few weeks, but now it just seems to fit right in. And as if all of this was somehow not yet enough, there's still more to talk about. On January the 18th, the nation of Jordan carried out its own airstrikes in Syria, a rare act for a nation that prefers to avoid being the aggressor and sit under the umbrella of its Western alliances. The Jordanian airstrike is believed to have killed at least 10 people in a town just 20 kilometers from Jordan's border with Syria. The strike most likely targeted drug smugglers responsible for the flow of amphetamines into Jordan, a problem Jordan has previously addressed with air attacks, but it is nonetheless another major airstrike within a span of a couple of weeks. And in northern Kurdish-controlled Iraq and Syria, Kurdish forces continue to weather attacks by Turkey as part of a much longer war against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, a separatist group that Turkey and its allies have long regarded as a terror organization. Loyalties and interests. With so many bold military actions from so many corners of the Middle East and even beyond, we're left asking the really central question of why is all this happening? And why now? Well, perhaps the simplest answer, as well as the most sweeping, is that each given nation or non-state actor who's attacking somebody else right now is emboldened by the fact that everybody else is making these sorts of attacks too. Every one of these strikes has a reason behind it. Israel wants to prosecute an offensive in Gaza, ward off Hezbollah, and attack the Iranian military infrastructure that allows the axis of resistance to function. Iran wants to attack Israel's international intelligence network and counter separatist movements that threaten violence on Iranian soil. Hamas wants to continue an ongoing initiative that it believes is rallying the Middle East behind Hamas's brand of the Palestinian cause. Hezbollah and the Houthis want to support Gaza while building their stature of international legitimacy as military actors. Iraq's militias want the US off their turf, and the Islamic State wants to create chaos within Iran. But none of these organizations, except perhaps the Islamic State and the current emboldened Israeli government, want to be the only guy on the block who's looking to start a street fight. If everybody's trading blows in a much larger brawl, each individual within that brawl has at least some cover amidst the confusion in order to get their own shots in. Then there's the degree to which these attacks reflect shifting priorities and shifting allegiances all across the Middle East. As we established earlier, normalization efforts between Israel and many Middle Eastern nations may be overall a good, stabilizing, life-saving force for the world, but they ran contrary to the interests of groups and organizations that only exist and only receive such strong backing from Iran because there are wars to fight. The worst-case scenario for Hamas, for example, isn't Israel's ongoing attempt to forcefully eradicate them from Gaza. In fact, that might even be helpful to their cause. As one Hamas media advisor told The Times in November 2023, "I hope that the state of war with Israel will become permanent on all the borders and that the Arab world will stand with us." The worst-case scenario is a piece of paper signed by Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and other relevant nations that charts a peaceful path forward for everyone, including the Palestinian people, but includes no place for Hamas, and might even provide leadership within Gaza that can do a much better job for Palestinians than Hamas can. We're seeing now that Gaza has plenty of places for Hamas to retreat to. The local population is now outright hostile to them. But if Hamas were to become outlaws even within Gaza, then they'll quickly run out of spaces to hide. So, in attempting to avoid normalization or other changes in circumstance that would see the Palestinian population turn against Hamas, the organization is now incentivized not to keep the people of Gaza safe, but to ensure that Israel keeps on looking like a great enemy that demands armed resistance. Apply that same framework to the Houthis, to the Iraqi militias, or to Hezbollah. That is, ask not who they're loyal to, but what their own internal priorities are. And we're all left asking one critical question about the axis of resistance, and that is, who is leading who? Hamas, Hezbollah, the Assad regime, the Houthis, and Iran's other partners all align generally with Iran's interests, but they are not Iran. These are groups with their own histories, their own ideologies, their own motivations, and perhaps most important of all, their own interests. And they don't necessarily align with Iran's. Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, Hezbollah skirmishes in northern Israel, or Iraqi militia attacks on American bases don't necessarily come at Iran's orders. And even if Iran had clear reasons to support those actions, that doesn't mean that Iran necessarily signed off on them. Iran will have its proxies backed. After all, they're some of the only allies that Iran has left. But those proxies' potential to conduct their own attacks and fight their own wars, even despite Iran's wishes or direction, cannot be ignored. Keep that dynamic going long enough and Iran will overextend into a situation it would rather have avoided. As for Israel's side of the equation, the nation's recent actions seem to indicate that there is very little room for negotiation and a substantial appetite to continue or even broaden hostilities. Israel's willingness to attack Quds Force targets isn't new, but its recent wave of airstrikes against Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iranian targets alike are still a major escalation past Israel's norm. In the days before this episode was written, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has outright rejected a proposal by Hamas to end the war in Gaza, and he has insisted publicly that Israel will not accept any end to the conflict that will result in an independent Palestinian state. That stance runs directly contrary to Israel's biggest international backer, the United States, and all but ensures that Israel would be condemned by large portions of the international community. Netanyahu's own ceasefire proposals have not included any provisions to remove Israeli troops from Gaza, a known and firmly established precondition that Hamas has made clear that it can't live without. Taken together, with all these other developments, Israel's broadening campaign of airstrikes paints a picture of a nation that is not averse to potentially wider conflict and is willing to take the risk of such an escalation if it means that the war in Gaza can be prosecuted as Israel sees fit. We cannot overlook the possibility that political concerns may be impacting the wartime strategies of the Netanyahu government, with Netanyahu himself facing significant social discontent at home and sitting atop a fragile coalition that relies on an extremist wing of the Israeli government to keep its majority. There's no telling how long he or the coalition would be able to remain in power after the war's end. Netanyahu's approval ratings took an early bump after the October 7th attack, but now the bump's not just gone. Netanyahu's current approval ratings in Israel are as low as 40%, and he faces a mounting pile of legal charges too. Over 100 recent polls have showed that his current coalition would not be able to retain control of Israel if elections were held now, and that number will likely get worse once the war ends. If we're going to take the cynical approach in the exceptionally cynical business of global politics, then we simply cannot ignore that a prolonged war would, in turn, prolong the Netanyahu coalition's opportunity to retain power. And as for the United States, the US's most recent wave of airstrikes into Yemen, done side by side with British forces as well, would indicate that the Biden administration is open to a much more sustained campaign against the Houthi rebel organization. US forces in Iraq and Syria, a combined force of 3,400 troops, show no sign of moving or being withdrawn in the face of continued attacks by local militias, even though those same ground forces don't currently seem able or willing to carry out a retaliatory campaign against those same militias. Instead, the US appears content to conduct tit-for-tat retaliatory strikes against Iraqi and Syrian militias on a case-by-case basis while keeping troops out of Yemen and attempting to defang the Houthis from the air. While the United States' actions are very much aligned with Israel's priorities in the region, specifically in tamping down Iranian influence, the two nations do not appear to be presenting a unified front either in Gaza or anywhere else. Israel is running the military operations it wishes to, and the US is running the operations it wishes to, and their diplomatic tiffs show no sign of stopping. Caught in the middle, Saudi Arabia and other predominantly Sunni governments that had previously started coming over to Israel's side have now been forced to define just where they stand amidst an ongoing Israeli offensive into Palestine. Saudi Arabia's Prince Faisal bin Farhan, the nation's leading diplomat, has established that while the prospect of normalized relations still do exist, it cannot happen if the Palestinian territories are not presented with a credible path to statehood. Not only that, but Saudi Arabia isn't even willing to participate in reconstruction efforts inside Gaza, rebuilding hospitals and schools or supplying humanitarian aid without the same path to Palestinian sovereignty. Of course, we just got done explaining how the Netanyahu government has insisted that there shall be no path to statehood for Palestine after the war ends. Unless either Israel or Saudi Arabia changes its tune, which neither are likely to do, then normalization is dead in the water. The Gulf states that already have ties to Israel, including the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar, have been reticent to give up the fruits of their normalization process. But Saudi Arabia is a very difficult leading influence to ignore, and Egypt, immediate to Israel's south, has indicated that its long-time diplomatic relationship to Israel may not survive if Israel continues on its current course. And lastly, we've got to circle back to Iran, where the events of the last several weeks indicate that the nation may either be becoming too willing to throw its own military weight around, or that it might have to. Iran's choice to launch its own missile strikes, and announce them no less, into several other nations runs contrary to their long-held preference to rely on their proxies. Domestically, this may be an effort for Iran's ruling clerics to demonstrate their power to their citizens and show that Iran is not so vulnerable as attacks like the Islamic State bombing might indicate. Internationally, Iran appears to be unwilling to start a direct fight with Israel or the United States, each of which it could do quite easily by just joining in on the wars or missile campaigns of any of its proxies. But nonetheless, Iran has been brazen with its more measured attacks, not trying to entice a war, but very obviously flexing its muscles. What comes next? So, finally, we come to the biggest question of all, don't we? Where does the Middle East go from here? And just how bad is all of this going to get? Well, we'll start with the good news, because as it turns out, we actually do have a little bit of good news to report. Of all the major battlefronts that could open up in the coming months, the border between Iran and Pakistan doesn't appear to be one of them. Iran's strikes into Pakistani parts of the Baloch region might have shocked Pakistan, but Pakistan has been careful not to overreact. The retaliation they offered was very clearly proportional to Iran's attack. Both Iran and Pakistan attacked militant groups on each other's territory, but not each other's military or civilians, and Pakistan used basically the same amount of force against basically the same value of target that Iran did. A couple of days later, Iran and Pakistan agreed to de-escalate tensions after a call between the foreign ministers of both countries. And while Pakistan's and Iran's leaders probably won't be going to each other's birthday parties anytime soon, both nations appear to have put in the work to defuse the situation without further violence. And unfortunately, though, that's where the good news ends, because in the grand view of the Middle East right now, Pakistan and Iran are an anomaly. None of Iran's proxy groups seem willing to back off from their respective battlefronts. Israel appears resolved to give no quarter to Hamas and take a bold, proactive stance against Hezbollah and Iran has proven more than willing to conduct lethal attacks against what it claims are Israeli targets on the soil of third nations. How Iran will ultimately respond to the Islamic State is anybody's guess, but we here at War of Graphics would be willing to bet that their eventual choice is going to be a violent one. And all that's going to be an issue, because every single one of the strikes we've discussed in this episode, excluding Iran and Pakistan, are going to be met with reprisal sooner or later. On balance, the offensive actions in this round of conflict do seem to be coming more from the Axis of Resistance side than their adversaries, but it's not realistic to think that those strikes would go unanswered, just like it's not realistic to think that Israel or Islamic State or even the American and British attacks we've discussed would go unanswered. Let's say Hezbollah, for example, was unwilling to retaliate against Israel for killing its commanders. In that scenario, Israel would simply have very little to fear by simply continuing to kill Hezbollah commanders in the future. The same logic goes the other way. Israel isn't about to let Iran launch missile strikes on what it claims are Mossad headquarters, especially if that allegation actually ends up being true, lest Iran be emboldened to keep on launching similar attacks in the future. And it's here that we're forced to confront the possibility that if these attacks continue to come from all directions, it won't be long until things really begin to escalate. That might come when one or multiple factions start to launch strikes more rapidly, or in larger waves, or against higher level or larger targets. It might come when air attacks and missile strikes are paired with other sorts of operations, say an Israeli troop march into southern Lebanon or a swarm of Houthi fast boats taking over a commercial ship in the Red Sea. If one side starts escalating, then whoever they're fighting will need to escalate as well, and then whoever else they're fighting will need to do the same thing. And soon enough, the situation escalates to the brink of a wider war, the very possibility that international observers have been so concerned about ever since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. The Middle East is on a hair trigger right now, and its current path of widening, escalating attacks from a whole range of hostile nations and non-state groups suggests that the pressure is only going to increase in the months to come. When we do the hopeful thing and start looking around for signs that someone might come in over the top of this violence with a real initiative to lower hostilities, we find nobody. Saudi Arabia and its allies appear content to sit back, protect their interests, and see how it goes, while much of the international community is divided or even unsure of where they stand. In situations like this, there's one cliche that comes to mind: a time bomb. Now, I've got to emphasize here that the current Mideast crisis isn't quite a time bomb yet, and the current escalation does not appear to be an inevitable countdown to detonation. But at the very least, it is a pressure cooker, and one in which the pressure on all sides has only continued to tick upward, bit by bit by bit. It's at this precise moment that some sort of valve, some sort of exit pathway to release even a little bit of that pressure could make a whole world of difference. But that release valve, it doesn't seem to exist. Now it's on Iran, it's on Israel, it's on the Axis of Resistance, it's on the US-led coalition, and it's on everybody else involved in the crisis to find such a path away from escalation before this thing turns into a war of far greater magnitude than anybody is prepared to handle.